Hey folks, it's me again. Greetings from wonderful San Francisco. I've just had an incredible time out here the last few days, and I can't wait to come back and tell you all about it. I got a chance to study with some amazing music writers from all around the country here. Before we get going, I have one other very special thing to do, and that is to say, "Go Red Sox!" World champs, fantastic. I watched it here in San Francisco last night, and I have to show you some of the video. It was really amazing. It's just an incredible experience. So go Sox. Um, of course, that I'm realizing now that sort of dates this to what is it, October 29th, 30th? Of 29th of 2018. In case I ever want to play this lecture again to any other groups of students, sorry, but when I originally recorded this, we had just won the World Series, so hence my enthusiasm. Okay, so what I wanted to get into with you all was actually continuing that lecture that I sent you the other day, which I assume you watched, sort of country music in America, Part 1. So this is going to kind of continue on that. I suppose you could call it Country Music Part 2. So we looked at some of the early figures of country music: Jimmie Rodgers, the Carter family, Hank Williams, and Patsy Cline. Now, if you just had that selection of early country music stars, you could actually go quite far. I was somewhere in San Francisco the other night, and I heard a Patsy Cline song come on, and sure enough, a couple starts dancing, and it was a little bit magical. So as I said, her music's going to sound, any country music is going to sound much different in the environment that it was really intended for. And country music as an American music that is the music of the vernacular. So it's going to be people just, they're not going to be thinking about it. They're just going to be playing it, in bars or wherever music is going to be, it's going to be played. So that's a pretty general statement. Never make general statements. So we're continuing on today with talking about some bluegrass. I wanted to get into, bluegrass is funny because bluegrass is actually quite popular today, remains quite popular today in a lot of different kind of like indie contexts. I'll talk about some players who do that. So we'll talk about bluegrass a little bit, and then I'll get into some rockabilly. And rockabilly, once we're sort of through bluegrass and rockabilly, we can start talking about some rock and roll in the 1950s. And again, a lot of these musical genres and styles have a lot of overlapping within them. So bluegrass, if you have your slides, your PDFs that I prepared, go ahead and take those out so you can follow along. So bluegrass is a style of Appalachian folk music that remains maybe not extremely, that's maybe going a bit too far, but it remains popular today amongst some, sub communities of musicians and fans. And just as a reminder, this is music that is very geographically specific to the Appalachian region of America. And the Appalachians, as we talked about in the last video lecture, are really the areas up in the mountainous regions of Kentucky, North Carolina, Tennessee, southernmost parts of Virginia and West Virginia, very isolated rural communities where music is one of the most popular things for people to spend their time doing, both 70, 80 years, 100 years ago and up to today. These are places where the music sort of the music kind of seeps from the soil itself. So bluegrass, what else? Bluegrass is extremely virtuosic, tends to be extremely virtuosic and fast. That's one thing that you can always tell about bluegrass, is that it's when you hear that that like really kind of fast rhythm, very virtuosic, so very difficult to play. That said, for all of the sort of like showboatiness, virtuosity on that side, bluegrass is very simple music harmonically. It tends to be just ones and fives, and I think we've talked a little bit about what I mean when I say 1 and 5. One is, remember, Roman numeral 1 is your home key. 5 is like the place you go and travel to for a little variety. That's in music theory we call that your dominant chord, your 5 chord. And then you go back to your 1. So your 1 would be like, if I just sing any note, la, 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 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So that's what I mean by 1 and 5 there. But again, I'm talking about chords. I'm talking about harmony and not necessarily individual pitches like I just sang right there. Ask me questions on that in class if you have anything further on that. So yeah, very simple harmonically, typically just 1s and 5s. Sometimes they'll throw in some other chords, for a little bit of variety, but it tends to be a very simple music from that perspective at least. It's highly dependent on improvisation. Improvisation is something we've sort of referenced when we talked about early jazz. Improvisation, a lot of people sort of mistakenly think that improvisation means that you are making up everything out of whole cloth as if you were, the first human being on a new planet. That's just not the case. I mean, improvisation, in order to improvise in any style, you have to do a lot of homework to be able to play in that style, particularly with something that is as historically rooted as bluegrass. And bluegrass players can be quite notorious for, there's a saying that is bluegrass, which basically means don't mess around with it too much. I remember years ago, I brought my trumpet to a bluegrass session at the Cantab Lounge in Central Square in Cambridge, and I got like a very dismissive, like, nope, like the trumpet is not a bluegrass instrument. You come back with a fiddle, with a mandolin, with a banjo, or a string bass, and you can play, but there's no trumpets in bluegrass. So they were like, yeah, I was like, oh, okay, all right, I guess for me, let me turn that off. For me, that struck me as quite conservative, but hey, that's, the people who make this music, a lot of them have earned the right to be very particular about that, I suppose. So improvisation within a certain context. Bluegrass usually features instruments like the banjo, which you see on the slide here, the upright or string bass, again, acoustic instruments made of in the case of, a string bass, be made of wood, something that, that comes from the earth. There's nothing electrical about bluegrass in its, most historical and pure sense, I suppose. Plus some exotic folk instruments like the dobro. One thing that you will never have in traditional bluegrass music is drums. Almost never. And that's like sort of a dead giveaway. If you hear drums in the music, you're not hearing traditional bluegrass. Now, you might be hearing some sort of modern incarnation of bluegrass that, mixes it with some pop music or some rap music or whatever. And you might, of course, have some drums in that. But in the traditional form of bluegrass, no drums. And I think I said that about country music as well. That's also kind of a dead giveaway to see, like, because when you listen to Jimmy Rogers or Hank Williams, if there's any drums at all, and I don't want to say like Hank Williams never used drums, because I think he probably did, but it was very, very low in the mix. So you're not going to hear any like kind of wailing drum stuff with this music. Another super important element of bluegrass music is that it features singing in tight harmonies. And if you remember what we talked about last time with the Carter family, you should know what I mean by tight harmony singing. So I'll ask you to play a tune after this slide, and you should be able to hear some of that sound of these singers. And it could be men, could be women. I suppose it tends to either be males singing or women singing. Usually not a mix, but of course there's exceptions to that. So you can hear a lot of tight harmony singing. The most famous player of traditional bluegrass was this guy named Bill Monroe. And Bill Monroe had a band called his Kentucky Mountain Boys. Bill Monroe was a singer. He was a mandolin player. He kind of did it all. And he kind of helped this music come to somewhat the forefront of so that people would know this style as a legitimate and very, very fun style of country music in the 1940s and 50s, kind of when he was making music. I don't go into him in super detail, but I do want you to know his name, Bill Monroe. On the music section, you'll see down at the lower right of that slide, I've got 3 tracks here. So number 1 is Del McCoury, great modern bluegrass player. So this is a modern recording. So just look that up, Rollin' My Sweet Baby's Arms. And you're going to hear in that track a lot of traditional bluegrass singing. It's very fast and also some great picking, some bluegrass picking. You might want to actually listen to the Bill Monroe track first because that's going to be the older one, Blue Moon of Kentucky. One of the, if there's such a thing as a standard in bluegrass music, that's definitely it. So listen to that song. We're going to come into that song again when we look at Elvis Presley, because Elvis Presley actually, his first major recording was basically a cover version of Blue Moon of Kentucky, which he actually takes out. He changes the meter of the song. In the version you'll listen to now, it's a waltz. It's like Blue Moon of Kentucky, keep on shining, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1. That's a waltz time, 3. Every time my finger was down there, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And what Elvis does is he actually puts it into 4/4 common time, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So it's kind of like a radical reinterpretation of it, but we'll listen to that when we get to Elvis Presley. So listen to Del McCoury, listen to Bill Monroe, and I also just have a little bullet point here about some other modern day bluegrass performers who you might want to check out. Bela Fleck is a fantastic banjo player, one of the world's great banjo players. He has a band called the Flecktones. I think they're still alive. They're still around. I know he's still alive. I think they're still a band, Bela Fleck and the Flecktones. Kind of maybe came out maybe like the early 1990s. And he'd have this drummer named Future Man who would play the drums like on something that looked like a guitar, and also one of the fiercest bass players in all of American music, Victor Wooten, on the bass in Bela Fleck's band. Check that out. As I said, Del McCoury, Ricky Skaggs, and Kentucky Thunder. Really, really accurate representation of bluegrass music, but performers playing it today. I wouldn't say that Ricky Skaggs is someone who really pushes the tradition in new or unusual or challenging ways. He kind of plays the music the way that it was played. Now some people might quibble with that, but that's my sort of interpretation of it. Anyway, you might want to listen to some Ricky Skaggs. Jerry Douglas, a dobro player, which is like the string instrument you see in a lot of this music. Alison Krauss and Union Station, they're a very popular band that has kind of been able to cross over a little bit into the domain of pop music. Alison Krauss was a fiddle player, and she was winning competitions when she was a little girl. And she ended up becoming a quite marvelous singer with a really pretty, pure voice. So that stuff actually sells quite well in country music. Of course, you'd never ever hear Alison Krauss played on modern commercial country radio. They really only care about the most recent stuff that they can sort of cash in on. They're not cashing in on Alison Krauss. But Alison Krauss and Union Station do make a lot of concerts around. They're pretty wonderful. 2 other bands, and one is Crooked Still. Actually, Crooked Still is no longer a band anymore, but I can still reference them. I had some friends who were in this band, or at least one friend. My friend Corey was the bass player for that band. Really great modern bluegrass playing. And then there's Nickel Creek. And Nickel Creek, I encourage you to listen to this track where it says music number 3 there. This was probably like their biggest hit, called This Side. And what you're going to hear in This Side is kind of like a modern pop music take on bluegrass. I mean, there's some stuff in here that almost kind of sounds like, I don't know, like the Backstreet Boys or something like that. It's very catchy in the way that they approach harmony singing. And in fact, when this band first came out, which was, I don't know, maybe 15 years ago or so, they were out a while ago, although they're all still pretty young musicians, they were kind of marketed almost like a boy band, although it's technically 2 boys and a girl in the band. It was so this their nominal leader, I suppose, the guy who was kind of like the front man, was Chris Thile. Chris Thile is one of the world's great musicians. I can't encourage you strongly enough to go dig into Chris Thile's music. Chris Thile is a mandolin player, which is this sort of like tiny little thing that looks like a it's like a guitar, but it's this big, and it has a really distinctive sound. And he is an absolute virtuoso on that instrument. Chris Thile recently took over the what used to be the Prairie Home Companion show that Garrison Keillor ran for many years on public radio. And I highly recommend that you check that show out if you're interested in American music. It runs from 6 to 8 p.m. every Saturday night on public radio all around the country. So in Boston, you would hear it on WGBH, which is 89.7 FM on Saturday nights from 6 until 8. And it's a live radio show. So they are doing not only music, but comedy sketches. Some of them are kind of corny, but they're still fun. He has stand-up comedians. He has like a monologuist on every week. Another cool thing that he does on that show is he will do like a musician's birthday, and he'll just find whatever musicians had their birthday that week, regardless of what type of music they made. Could be any. Could be like avant-garde classical to a pop musician to a jazz composer or whatever. And then the band will cover a song by that artist. The other thing, he takes song requests from Twitter. And so if you were listening to the show and you wanted to request a song, there's a chance he might pick it. And then he has to teach the song in the moment live to the band. And they all figure it out because they're a phenomenal band. So I definitely recommend that. Anyway, back to Nickel Creek. So Chris Thile led that band, Nickel Creek, which is kind of how he got famous. And two other great performers, a brother and sister. Sarah Watkins is a great fiddle player and a wonderful singer and songwriter who has her own solo career at this point, which has been quite lovely to watch her career. And then her brother, Sean Watkins, was the acoustic guitarist. So it's just a trio, but they all sang, and they just did really, really well. They're no longer a band together. They're all pursuing their own solo careers. There's plenty of other bluegrass, modern bluegrass incarnations if you wanted to dig into it. I think this music is some of the most fun music that we would look at all semester. So I'm kind of bummed that I'm actually not in the room with you playing this stuff for you. But please dig into that because I have a feeling that even if you don't think that you might like this style of country music, I think it's pretty infectious. And if you hear the right stuff, I think you'd probably be kind of bopping along. So it's a lot of fun. Cool. Okay, so draw a line. I am going to next talk about another historical style coming out of the late 1940s, early 1950s. One of the things that goes into rock and roll, very, very important ingredient in rock and roll, and that is this music called rockabilly. So go ahead and advance your next slide. Rockabilly was set up by an individual. So actually I want to start talking about rockabilly by associating it with one individual, and that guy's name was Sam Phillips. Sam Phillips is he's probably the first producer of arguably pop music that we have looked at all semester. We talked a little bit, like when we looked at Sinatra, Bing Crosby in the 30s and 40s, we talked about the role of the arranger, someone who's kind of tasked with writing music for an orchestra that might back up the singer or for a big band or what have you. And as the technology improves, by the time we get to the 1950s and particularly 1960s, arrangers are kind of on their way out because less musicians are recording with those types of large instrumental ensembles. And what is becoming more in is the idea of a producer who can actually work in a recording studio to do a lot of that kind of behind the scenes wizardry. And of course, nowadays, when you look at producers, some of the producers in pop music are arguably just as famous, if not more famous, than some of the artists that they work for, particularly in the realm of hip hop, where so many wonderful hip hop artists and rappers are also producers on the side. So yeah. Again, anyway, back to Sam Phillips. So he's one of the first producers that we look at. He was a white guy who was obsessed with both the music that was being made in the Appalachian region by white. Remember, they were called hillbilly artists at the time, and then becomes called country around this time period. So hillbilly/country. But he was also a huge fan of the rhythm and blues music that was being made by black musicians, particularly in the Mississippi Delta, as we talked about, more of that country sound, but also in places like Chicago with the electrified stuff. I think it's important to keep in mind that in this early era of rock and roll, Um, Rock and roll was so new and so undeveloped. It was so uncharted in terms of where people thought it might land. The majority of music critics and record executives, and probably the majority of everyone, thought that this was going to be a passing fad. Like it might be around for a year or so, and then everything would sort of revert back to the comfort of big band music and crooning and Tin Pan Alley standards and stuff like that. And obviously, we know 70 years later that did not even come close to coming to coming true, because when rock and roll hits in the early 1950s, American culture really never looked back. It's typically how things work. You don't see things revert back very often. So in 1940, so the point that I was going to make on that was that a lot of the early rock and roll was actually, because it was not seen as something that was going to make a lot of money, the major record labels that had all the funding and money wouldn't touch it, even if they knew about it, because they made money off of big band singers and sort of light jazz. So they were not taking this stuff seriously. So because of that reason, most of the important early rock and roll music, and I would include rockabilly as more or less the first real style of rock and roll, most of rockabilly is released on independent record labels. So in a sense, this is kind of like the first indie music in America. And Sam Phillips was one of those independent producers, and he ended up running this record label called Sun Records, a very, very important record label in rock and roll history. So in 1949, Sam Phillips is in Memphis, Tennessee, close to the Mississippi Delta, where a lot of these, what he saw as authentic black blues and rhythm and blues singers were hanging out. And he purchases an old radiator shop. If you don't know what a radiator is, and if you have any older relatives, or if you're ever in like an old hotel or something, I don't think they really have them in most places anymore. But a radiator is the thing that would warm your room. Or your house. So there's this radiator shop, and it had this really interesting kind of physical dimensions, and the dimensions of that radiator shop actually help influence the sound of the recordings that he would actually make in this recording studio for Sun. Sun was very famous for this kind of echoey sound, tape delay echo was what they called it, but a lot of it was also influenced by the particular dimensions of this recording studio that Sam Phillips kind of thrown together. So he sets that up in 1949, and in 1951 he makes one of his first records, and probably his first record that hits really big, and it hits so big that historians ever since have called it the first rock and roll record. The song is called Rocket 88. It is like most of the rock and roll songs that were popular around this era, it was about a car. Rocket 88 was a type of car that you could drive really fast and impress the heck out of your friends. Most early rock and roll songs, as I said, if they're not about cars, they're about girls, or they're about school. So this was music that was directly appealing to teenagers, going after that market. And remember, when we looked at Frank Sinatra and his rise to stardom in the early 1940s, I think a point that I made at that time was that this idea of a teen audience didn't really exist until someone like Frank Sinatra really hit. And then so that had already been kind of set up by the time we get to the 1950s, so teenagers being kind of actively marketed to. Okay, Rocket 88 by a guy named Jackie Brenston and his Delta Cats. Jackie Brenston did not go on to become a super famous musician after this particular recording, even though the recording was quite popular. But he did feature a piano player in his band called the Delta Cats by the name of Ike Turner. So if you've ever heard of Tina and Ike Turner, like very famous soul duo in the 1960s, Ike Turner, actually one of his first gigs was playing in this band, playing piano. So go listen to Rocket 88, hit pause and come back to it and just listen to a little bit of it. Not surprisingly, I know you're going to be shocked, it's a 12-bar blues. Remember, 95% of these songs in this era are nothing but 12-bar blues. Maybe not 95%, but a whole lot of them. So in 1953, Sam Phillips actually sets up Sun Records out of his recording studio. And Sam Phillips works in every capacity for Sun Records. He works as engineer, as producer, as talent scout. He travels all around the country looking for talent, although he ends up signing most people from this area around Memphis, and publicist. So he's kind of a one-man wrecking crew for this record label. As I mentioned, this tape delay echo technique comes as a result of this cramped studio dimensions. You're going to hear that particularly in Elvis Presley's early recordings. Okay, flip to the next slide. And again, Sam Phillips' recordings for Sun are codifying, cementing into place this musical style known as rockabilly, which is a combination of hillbilly, country, and rhythm and blues. This is a crossover music. This is a music that is it has elements of country music, but you don't have to be a country music fan to enjoy it. It has elements of rhythm and blues music, but you don't have to just be a rhythm and blues fan to enjoy it. So they were kind of crossing this stuff over into the more popular commercial marketplace. And rock and roll historian Thomas Larson actually calls this the first style of rock and roll, and I think that's probably accurate, because with rockabilly, we start to get some of the racial ingredients. In order to have rock and roll, you need to have white country music and black rhythm and blues, and it's a combination of these two things that produces this type of sound. So some points on rockabilly. Again, I would call it the earliest true style of rock and roll. It's going to be influenced by rhythm and blues, as I mentioned. And I know I said country above, but it's really more specifically honky-tonk. We looked at honky-tonk when we talked about Hank Williams. So when you get Hank Williams style honky-tonk and you add black rhythm and blues to that, you get this rockabilly sound. So you're going to have very fast tempos, possibly related to bluegrass in that sense. You're going to get this kind of nervous, jumpy beat. It kind of feels like someone has ants in their shoes or something sometimes when you hear this music. Ants in their shoes. Wow, that's an interesting metaphor. So it's very sparse instrumentation. You're just going to have typically electric or acoustic guitar, some upright slap bass, still acoustic bass, not electric bass yet, and finally, we're going to get some drums in this music. By the time we get to rockabilly around 1950, you're going to hear, it's still not going to be a huge usage of the drums, but you're going to start to hear some like snare stuff and, people using brushes as well to kind of mute that sound. But that is kind of more so in the later Sun recordings with Sam Phillips. You're going to hear, finally, a single vocalist using an effect that I typically call hiccuping. If you listen to it, it's almost like a vocal tick. You'll recognize it once you hear it. It's kind of hard to do, but it's something like it's. I know you're laughing. You're like, what a goofy person who's talking to me from a hotel room in San Francisco and going Somehow they pay me to do this. It's so weird. So you'll hear that particularly in Elvis Presley's recordings. You definitely hear it in Jerry Lee Lewis's recordings as well. And then some of the other vocalists in this era as well. You're going to have some backup vocals, all recorded with a heavy, heavy dose of echo. So looking at this photo here of Sam Phillips, it says The Sun King, The Life and Times of Sam Phillips, the man behind Sun Records. Down below that photo of Sam Phillips, you're going to see four dudes who were basically the stars of this music and came together to really codify this sound and kind of, bring things toward the direction of rock and roll. On your far left there, you're going to have Jerry Lee Lewis. We're going to talk about him next. He is still alive. He's sort of the original wild man of rock and roll, piano player. To his right, you're going to have Carl Perkins, probably the least famous member of out of these four at least. You may not know his name. But if you've ever heard the song Blue Suede Shoes, that's recorded by Elvis. That's a Carl Perkins song. So he was pretty well known in his time. Seated to the right of Carl Perkins is, of course, Elvis Presley, a man who would really go on to transform American popular music and singing around this time period enormously. So we will definitely talk about him. And then standing to Elvis's right there is who? Anyone? Anyone? I didn't hear it. Oh, no. No one said Johnny Cash. Yeah, well, if you did say Johnny Cash, were you yelling at me? You're gonna just, oh, you were like yelling at the screen? Well, I'm glad you're at least paying attention. Um, you really only watch this for the bad comedy bits, I assume, right? So Johnny Cash, the Man in Black, massively important, famous, influential rock and roll musician coming out of country music, but he had a quite long recording career and actually lives as long enough to make it on MTV and become kind of like a cult star amongst teenagers in America in the late 1990s. So he had like a big kind of revival, and even beyond then. I'm sure most of you probably know Johnny Cash. That quartet was a sort of unofficial band. I don't think they actually ever performed as a band anywhere live or had any kind of like a presence as the four of them. What it was basically just a pickup jam session. I think I'm pretty sure it was Jerry Lee Lewis was playing piano on a recording session for Carl Perkins. I think that's what it was. And Sam Phillips then, he's like, oh, they have kind of really good rapport. They're just hanging, jamming. And Elvis Presley stops by the studio to kind of just say hello, see what's happening. At that point, Sam Phillips gets on the phone and he calls up Johnny Cash and he says, come down to the studio. We got three of, the best known players, and, you guys should all hang out and, make some music together. So they end up recording, I think it's like 2 or 3 hours of music as basically a pickup jam session. And the name of that band is the $1 Million Quartet. So the $1 Million Quartet is like this almost mythological group of early rock and roll. In fact, there's a Broadway show. I believe it's still on Broadway right now. You could check, but I know it was recently. It got turned into a Broadway show, the kind of genesis of this very, very famous recording session, which only, as far as I remember, it only happened on one day. And it's almost like a punk session because like every song is like a minute or less. Not every, but they're very, very short takes on these songs. And they just sort of keep rolling through them. When they finish one, someone will call out another one. So listen to some $1 Million Quartet. There is a track called Just a Little Talk with Jesus. I think if you can find that one, that would be the one to listen to for the $1 Million Quartet. And most of these songs, there's all kinds of songs. There's some rhythm and blues, there's some hillbilly songs, there's even some Christmas songs, I think. But the vast majority of the songs that they record are gospel songs, or white gospel songs. Why? Because all of these four men came up with that background. So Just a Little Talk with Jesus, obviously a gospel song. And when you hear that song, you'll hear Elvis Presley calling the name of that song, and then they all pick up on it, and then he actually is like, let's slow it down, and they actually go to like a halftime kind of feel. So it's very, very improvised kind of jam session, and obviously historians love that stuff because because of the fact that it is not produced. They get to hear how the musicians, it's like being a fly on the wall in the room. They get to be in that room and just sort of observing and taking notes on how the musicians are interacting, what elements of this new music, which wasn't yet being called rock and roll yet, but they knew they had some kind of a very exciting sound. They knew that they were at the forefront of something, even if they didn't know what it was called yet. It's a very exciting time. So yeah, $1 Million Quartet. And the last point I'll make here about Sam Phillips before we move on is that there's a very, very famous quote from rock music around this time period, definitely one of the most famous rock and roll quotes of all time. And, which points again to this focus on race that is so, so important, not only to us this semester, but to the entire history of American popular music and the entire present of American popular music. If you are not talking about race, you are not doing American popular music history justice. I absolutely think that they are one and the same. So a little little speech there. Sam Phillips knew that he was onto something with this form of music, but he was very, very cautious as a record company owner, thinking as a businessman. He knew that country music, or hillbilly music, starts to be called country music around this time. He knew that that stuff was selling really well. He knew he had an audience for that, but he also knew that what people really wanted was the black rhythm and blues music that was, being made in Memphis, from the Mississippi Delta, and then also from these northern cities as well. He knew that people really wanted that, but as a businessman, he didn't think that white people would buy that music as made by black recording artists. That's the sad fact of, that was his business reality to deal with at that time. And the quote that comes out of that is he is alleged to have said, "If I could find me a white man who sang with the Negro feel." He was not saying that to be necessarily offensive at that time. That was just, it was a more in common word in that era. And black people themselves used the word Negro at that time. But he said, "If I could find me a white man who sang with the Negro feel, I could make $1 million." So, as that's a statement from a businessman. Like what Jay-Z said, "I'm not a businessman, I'm a businessman." Anyway, Sam Phillips ends up finding someone to do that. It's like he figures out the equation. What he needs is basically a white guy who sounds black, in order to get this music to really sell amongst people who were buying his records. Again, this is sort of a business decision. And he does find that when a young man by the name of Elvis Presley walks through the door of Sun Studios. And then Sam Phillips had exactly what he was looking for, which was a white guy who was deeply, deeply influenced, and also, I should say, quite respectful of black culture and black music. Cool. So we will get to Elvis Presley separately. In the time that remains, I want to look at two artists, two other members of the $1 Million Quartet. Poor Carl Perkins doesn't get his own section. Sorry, Carl. At least I mentioned you, though. So Jerry Lee Lewis, born in 1935. Go ahead and advance your slide. Jerry Lee Lewis is the only member of this era of music that I know, the super famous member. He's the only super famous musician of this era to still be alive. Rock's first great wild man. You see this great photo of him there playing the piano, wearing what appears to be a Foot Locker. He wore a lot of these Foot Locker shirts, and of course, that happened quite in reverse. Foot Locker, I assume, didn't come around until 1980s or so, and I'm sure that when they were, I suppose they were taking referees' shirts. But maybe referees' shirts were influenced by Jerry Lee Lewis. I have a feeling that Jerry Lee Lewis probably made this stuff popular first. Or maybe the referees did it first. Who knows? You could look it up. Anyway, it's one of his signature fashion things, is this kind of Foot Locker shirt. I call it the Foot Locker shirt. So Jerry Lee Lewis, as a singer, as a songwriter, but most importantly as a pianist, as a piano player of rockabilly and early rock and roll. Really audacious and very, very physical piano player. He almost is like a punk musician. And it's one of the first times in rock and roll or in popular music in general where it's not only about the sound of the music, but it's also how you're performing the music, which is something that we're very, very used to today. We expect, for the most part, American musicians today to dance, to have some sort of like really great stage presence, particularly in rock and roll, in hip hop, in dance music. Think of Beyonce. It wouldn't be enough for Beyonce to just be a singer. She's also got to do all these other things, related to her performance style. Madonna. So yeah, in a lot of music today, we have that. Jerry Lee Lewis's nickname was the Killer because he would kill when he got on the piano. He was described as he was described by another singer, very, very wonderful singer of this era of rockabilly, it's kind of a crime that I don't have, a special slide for Roy Orbison. Roy Orbison was a fantastic vocalist. If you know the song Pretty Woman, walking down the street, pretty woman, the kind I'd like to meet, pretty woman. I don't believe. Da, 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 da. It's a great song. You know, you go find it. Of course, they made the movie with Julia Roberts and Richard Gere also in the 1980s. You know, with that same name of that song. But lots of other great Roy Orbison songs as well. Crying, Only the Lonely, classic stuff. Anyway, Roy Orbison called Jerry Lee Lewis the best raw performer in the history of rock and roll. Jerry Lee was born in Faraday, Louisiana. He went to a high school that was a very conservative, out of an evangelical tradition. I'm not sure if it was Presbyterian. I forget the exact denomination, but you could look it up. And he was actually he was expelled from the school, as legend has it, for playing a white gospel hymn on the piano at a talent show. What was the name of that song? It was Jesus Means the World to Me. It was a white gospel song, but he plays it in a black piano style of a type of music that was called boogie woogie. And so he takes this sort of sacred white church song and he turns it into a black song. And that was enough to get him expelled from school. So again, you can, even though we're talking about white country music, you know, specifically here, race is always a part of this music. If it's in America, it has something to do with race. So he's booted out of that school, but he did grow up playing gospel music as a child. Jerry Lee, I think, as much as anyone of this era, speaks to the kind of simultaneous impulses within early rock and roll. Most of these musicians had backgrounds in the gospel church, yet at the same time, they also led these lives of lots of drinking, lots of partying. They would kind of burn the candle at both ends. They're very, very extreme personalities, both very, very deeply religious, and then also just staying out until 3 or 4 in the morning, you know, drinking Southern Comfort or whatever it was they were not. Southern Comfort was Janis Joplin. I don't know who. I don't know what. These guys were probably drinking bourbon if they're in, you know, Tennessee, Kentucky, around that area. So lots of sort of dichotomy there. I think who's it? Johnny Cash's daughter, one of the stars of this music's daughter, said a quote that was something like, "My father knew the headaches of Sunday morning the way that the hangover in church, the way that someone who only had stayed out drinking until 3 in the morning on Saturday night had known." That was a very inelegant way of saying that beautiful quote, but it's something like the connection between Saturday night partying and Sunday morning going to church that is like very, very opposite. So you see that in a lot of these performers in this era. And even until today, for my money, the best singers in America always have been singers that came out of the church. You grow up with it, and you're getting in touch with that kind of feel, that emotion. You don't have to kind of think of that, you know, later in life then. Famously fiery personality, Jerry Lee Lewis, of course, played the piano, and one early promoter told him he should quit the piano and take up the electric guitar, which was becoming far more famous and popular at that time. Jerry Lee Lewis said, "You can take that guitar and stick it up your ass." So that's kind of who he was. That's how he talked. December 4th, 1956, that's the actual date. As I mentioned, the $1 Million Quartet records at Sun Studios, and hopefully you've already listened to a little bit of that. 1957, Jerry Lee's first big hit is called Great Balls of Fire. You probably know it. It's a massive hit in early rock and roll. Make sure you listen to that, Great Balls of Fire. If you want an extra one, listen to A Whole Lot of Shakin' Going On, which is, again, a 12-bar blues. We have those everywhere. Jerry Lee Lewis is probably the first star of, I suppose, what we could call piano rock. We don't have too many, you know, great rock and roll pianists. The rock and roll is very dominated by electric guitar, but there are a number of great piano players. Not only Jerry Lee Lewis, but what's the guy's name? I was just thinking of his name. Elton John in the 1970s, Ben Folds today. There are plenty of others, even in this era, especially, we talk about boogie woogie piano players. And also an incredible showman on the piano. As I said earlier, he would light his piano on fire. Or I'm not sure if it was just done for publicity photos, but there's a very famous photograph of Jerry Lee Lewis lighting his piano on fire. So again, this is punk music. It's not really. It's 25 years before punk music, but it is setting up a lot of the stuff for it. Maybe even 15 or 20 years before punk music rather than 25. Jerry Lee was always known as a bad boy. He got in a lot of hot water when he married his second cousin once removed. That's pretty far, but still. And also it's the fact that she was 13. That's really the part that got him in trouble. Ruined his career. He had to move to Germany, where he becomes quite popular over there. And he does regain some popularity in Europe, particularly after the release of a live album in 1964 called Live at the Star Club, Hamburg, one of the most famous albums of rock and roll. There's a great quote from a music journalist, but I guess I don't have that in this slide here, but just talking about how it was the most phenomenal live recording perhaps ever made, and how, bands like the Sex Pistols and the Ramones sound like wimps compared to this particular live recording. So give that a spin if you want. Live at the Star Club Hamburg by Jerry Lee Lewis. Still living. And I'm not quite sure what happened with I think he stayed married to, I think Myra Gale Brown, I think that was her name. I think she eventually died, but I think they were actually married for quite a long time. So make of that what you will. Moving along to Johnny Cash, the Man in Black, very, very famous country rockabilly singer. You've probably heard of him. They say the scale of badass goes from 0 to Johnny Cash. Born in 1932, died in 2003, so not too long ago. Johnny Cash was a singer, a songwriter, and a star of early rock and country music. Also was the husband of June Carter Cash, June Carter of the very famous Carter family that we already looked at. He was born in Kingsland, Arkansas. I don't think we've seen anyone from Arkansas yet. He was born with the name J.R. J.R. didn't stand for anything. It was just 2 initials. And so people just called him JR. And when he signed up for the military, when he turned 18, they said, "What's your name?" And he said, JR. And they said, "It can't be JR. You have to actually have a regular name. You can't just be initials." So he made up the name Johnny. That was not his name, but he made up Johnny on the spot. So he tries to convince Sam Phillips in Memphis to record him at the Sun Studios singing gospel music, white gospel music, what most of these guys were singing. And Sam Phillips turns him down, and he says that he wants him to go home and sin, then come back with a song I can sell. Another pretty famous quote of this era. So Johnny Cash does some of that, and then he comes back with a much different sound, and he does start to record for Sun Records in 1955 with his first big hits, which were called Hey Porter and Cry, Cry, Cry. Listen to those if you want. I wouldn't say, they're required, but it, can't hurt. I do want you to listen to the next song of his, which contains his biggest hit. You probably know it. It's the one that I would expect you to know. It's called I Walk the Line. And of course, Walk the Line is the name of the film version of Johnny Cash's life, which was made in, 2011, sometime around then, with Joaquin Phoenix playing Johnny Cash and Reese Witherspoon playing his wife, June Carter Cash. Really, really wonderful film. I think they were both up for Grammys that year. I think Reese Witherspoon won not the Oscar for Best Actress that year, but she's also from this part of the country. I think she's from Tennessee, so she really nails the accent clearly, and she also sings. They both sing. They do all their singing on that record. Back to Johnny, don't call me J.R. Cash. So Johnny Cash had two major albums at prisons that you should know about. 1968, Johnny Cash at Folsom Prison, which featured the crossover hit called A Boy Named Sue. That'd be another good one to listen to. A Boy Named Sue, this is one of my fun rock and roll trivia questions. Guy who wrote the lyrics for A Boy Named Sue, anyone know? Shel Silverstein, that's right. The children's book author, if you ever, when you were growing up, had any of those books, Where the Sidewalk Ends, Where A Light in the Attic, The Giving Tree, all really, really beautiful books. Yeah, Johnny Cash worked with Shel Silverstein on the song A Boy Named Sue, I believe. So these prison records point to Johnny Cash's kind of his very deliberate marketing plan to sell himself as an outlaw, as someone who was not in jail. Johnny Cash never actually did a day in jail in his life, but that he would be someone who'd be seen as hanging out there at least. It's part of his marketing, part of his branding, this kind of outlaw appeal, and frankly, outlaws loved him. So when you listen to these records, you hear a lot of people just hooting and hollering and screaming for him. So Johnny Cash at Folsom Prison, go listen to a little bit of that. Very famous live album with its. Just picture the cover of it. And it's got this like blue light. It's it's obviously a live shot from him at that concert. So pretty great records, and the fact that they're made at prisons really is kind of a very big clue as to what he's trying to do here. Johnny Cash toured with the Carter family in the 1960s, where he meets his wife, June. He was very, very dedicated to his wife, June. And of course, because she was a Carter, she could do some great harmony singing. So they actually ended up doing some live concerts together. And they had a big hit with a song called Jackson. And Jackson is, I think it's probably their most famous duet song. They do it in the movie. With Joaquin Phoenix and Reese Witherspoon. So go listen to Jackson. That'd be a good Johnny and June recording to know about. During the early 1960s, Johnny Cash becomes severely addicted to pills and alcohol. 2006. I said 2011? Wow, that movie came out that long ago? Wow. Go see that movie if you haven't seen it. It's it'd be a good Netflix one. With most of the musicians we look at in this era, we don't talk about like a late career. There's something we talk about a lot in musicology and in scholarship, the idea of late career music, like their late works. Like the music Beethoven wrote in the last year of his life, or the last year of Billie Holiday's recordings. What does it mean for a musician who's like, time is short on this earth, and they're trying to get it all out kind of at the last minute. And I think that Johnny Cash is a really good example of lateness in pop music. I don't mean pop music the way you think of pop radio. I'm just in popular music history in America. So he goes to, a bit about his 80s. That's not even really the period I'm talking about in terms of his late period, but I'll at least mention the 80s before I go into that. And he forms a supergroup called the Highwaymen with fellow country music stars Waylon Jennings, Willie Nelson, and Chris Christopherson. Supergroup is a band that is formed out of people who are already quite famous, and obviously they're going to sell out wherever they play because it's a 4-for-1. Chris Christopherson is a great songwriter and actor. I assume you know Willie Nelson, great songwriter as well. Those two guys are still alive. I don't think Waylon Jennings is still alive. Wonderful songwriter and guitar player and singer himself, Waylon Jennings. So it's really fantastic group. During the late 1990s, which is Johnny Cash's late period, he becomes extremely popular again amongst this sort of like alternative audience of young music fans. And he does some albums with a man by the name of Rick Rubin. Rick Rubin, if you know anything about hip-hop music, is one of the major producers in hip-hop rap music over the last 15, 20 years. He's worked with Jay-Z quite a lot. His most famous track with Jay-Z, which I'm sure you all know, it's called 99 Problems. I mean, it's like such a distinctive sound, one of the most popular rap songs ever made. And the production on it is just utterly unreal. You hear these like octaves in the left hand of the piano that are just like this dun, like this dark, dank sonic presence. It's almost like if you hear like a redwood tree falling in the forest, dun, And so go listen to some of those recordings, which are on a record label that was called the American Recordings label, which was Rick Rubin's label. And you'll see on these records, sorry, I'm parched from talking from my lecture for so long. You'll hear in these recordings a very kind of like very naked, very minimalist musical style. That's usually just going to be Johnny Cash and a piano, maybe a bass guitar, maybe some drums. But there's not going to be like any kind of a big overproduced style here. So very minimalistic. That was a style that Johnny Cash always wanted to perform in, actually. But the producers who made a lot of money off his music in the 1970s and 80s kind of wouldn't let him. So this is finally he's old enough where he kind of gets to call the shots, and he works with Rick Rubin on these recordings, and they are absolutely phenomenal. If you don't know the Johnny Cash American Recordings label or American Recordings series, you're missing out. I think there's maybe about 7 or 8 of these recordings. They're all these very stark visual depictions on the covers, usually black and white. Looks like some old, Walker Evans photo from the 1930s. Walker Evans was a photographer, went around and photographed a lot of rural people in the South. Which go check out some Walker Evans, amazing stuff. So on these records, you're going to hear Johnny Cash doing a mix of gospel songs. In fact, there is one of my favorite records is a song that's called My Mother's Hymn Book, and it is actually a recording of gospel songs that Johnny Cash's mother used to sing to him. Really, really beautiful, quite moving, quite affecting recording, effective and affecting. But there's going to be some pop songs as well. You may already know the big, massive hit that came off of one of these records. So that would be the one that I'm actually going to require you to listen to. If you listen to nothing else from Johnny Cash, you must listen to the song Hurt, which was a song, as probably many of you already know, was a Nine Inch Nails song. So this like super popular alternative band from the 1990s. And Johnny Cash just absolutely transforms Hurt. It is a magisterial recording of American pop music and quite disturbing. So, and famous for its video as well. So see if you can watch the video of Johnny Cash's Hurt. Cash on these records is obsessed with death. These are late recordings. He's obsessed with images from the Bible. And he, in fact, writes a few songs on, I think it's the same album that Hurt is from. He writes a song called When the Man Comes Around. And when the man comes around starts with the phrase, what is it? There's a man going around taking names. So it's very biblical stuff. It's not that song. I'm thinking of another song where he actually starts the song with lyrics from a dream that he had. There was this sort of like apocalyptic, Book of Revelations, really, really like dark and actually pretty trippy stuff. So Johnny Cash writing songs based on some of that imagery. So as I say here, his final recordings deal with death and lateness in very profound ways. This My Mother's Hymn Book, very pure, stripped down, moving recording of church hymns and gospel songs. Okay, so that was quite a lot. Oh, that's coming up on an hour. Wow, okay. In 20 seconds, that'll be an hour. So that's a lot. So if you made it through all that, kudos to you. So obviously, I'll say in the email, you feel free to split this up into 2 or 3 kind of shifts if you want. This is fun. I think I maybe want to think about doing some more of this in a different context. So I'm curious to hear you all, like, what you think could be better. Obviously, if I had a band next to me, that would be a lot better. But I do kind of like being on the screen and feeling like I can talk with all y'all. So anyway, I hope you had a great weekend, and I will see you all very soon. I'll remind you in the email when that is. And happy listening. And